The rain poured down in torrents, as if the sky had been waiting for this moment to unleash its fury. Ethan's windshield wipers squeaked and groaned against the glass, struggling to provide even a momentary glimpse of the road ahead. The distant rumble of thunder reverberated through the valley, accompanied by flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the jagged cliffs and twisted branches of the surrounding forest. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. The road he had chosen wasn't the most direct way home, but it promised a scenic drive. If only the weather had cooperated. Now, he regretted every decision that had led him to this desolate mountain road on such a night. The hum of the car engine provided a strange comfort as he navigated the treacherous curves. Gravel crunched under the tires, heightening his awareness of how close he was to the edge. A wrong turn could send him tumbling down the cliffs, and no one would find him for days. Suddenly, a gust of wind shook the car, and Ethan's breath hitched as he swerved to avoid a fallen branch. The vehicle's tires squealed in protest against the slick surface of the road. He cursed under his breath, wrestling for control. The image of a steep drop mere inches from his wheels etched into his mind. As the car steadied, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the whispers he'd heard in town. Tales of ghostly figures that haunted this very mountain road during storms. His rational mind had dismissed them as mere folklore, the stuff of campfires and bedtime stories to scare children. But now, alone in the storm's grip, those stories slithered back into his consciousness, wrapping around his growing unease. The whispers started softly, barely discernible over the loud rumble of the storm. Ethan strained to focus his attention, trying to locate their source as they grew louder, surrounding him. He shook his head, trying to clear the phantom voices, but they persisted, fueling a sense of dread that settled deep within his bones. Ethan's mind raced, grasping for an explanation, anything that would ground him back to reality. But the mountain road held its secrets close, and the storm continued its relentless assault. But then, a flicker of movement snapped him back to reality. Straining to get a better view, he saw her. A young woman standing on the edge of the road, scarcely visible through the curtain of rain. A shadowy figure by the roadside, almost blending into the darkness. Ethan's foot instinctively hovered over the brake, ready to stop. But an inner voice urged him to keep driving, not to stop, for whatever or whoever it was. Her hair clung to her face, and she wore a soaked, pale dress that clung to her body like a second skin. She raised a hand, a desperate gesture, as if she had been waiting there for hours. Ethan slowed the car and rolled down the passenger side window. The cold and rain rushed in, chilling him to the bone.
"Do you need a ride?"
He called out. She nodded, her lips trembling.
Please. Thank you.
He unlocked the door, and she slid inside, shivering violently. Water pooled beneath her, but Ethan didn't care. She was soaked to the bone, her teeth chattering as she buckled her seatbelt.
I didn't think anyone would ever stop.
She said, her voice barely audible over the rain.
"It's no problem."
Ethan replied, forcing a smile.
"What's a girl like you doing out here in the middle of nowhere?"
I was visiting a friend.
She said, hugging her arms around herself.
My car broke down a few miles back. I tried calling for help, but my phone died.
Ethan nodded, glancing at her. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, with wide, dark eyes and an air of fragility. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her dress, once white, he assumed, was stained with mud. Something felt off, but he pushed the thought aside. The rain was making him paranoid.
"What's your name?"
He asked, hoping to break the tension.
Lila.
She replied softly.
And you?
"Ethan."
He said, forcing a smile. She smiled back faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something haunted about her gaze, as if she had seen things she would never forget. He wanted to ask her more, to understand why she was really out here, but the words caught in his throat.
"Where do you need to go?"
Just down the road.
She said, pointing ahead.
There's a small town about 10 miles from here. I can get a room there for the night.
He nodded again and focused on the road. The rhythmic beat of the rain became a steady backdrop to their silence. The only other sound was her breathing, shallow and uneven, as if she were trying to calm herself. They drove in silence for several minutes, the car swaying gently as they rounded another bend. The headlights barely penetrated the dense fog creeping across the road, swirling like ghostly tendrils.
I've always hated this road.
Lila said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Ethan glanced at her.
Why's that?
It's dangerous. Too many accidents. My mother used to tell me stories about this place when I was a kid. She said it was cursed.
Cursed?
He chuckled nervously.
What kind of curse?
She said people see things out here. Things that aren't supposed to be real. Ghosts, mostly. Hitchhikers who disappear. Cars that vanish without a trace. I used to think she was just trying to scare me, but now...
She trailed off, staring out the window as if she expected to see something lurking in the shadows.
Well, let's hope we don't run into any ghosts tonight.
Ethan said, trying to lighten the mood. But Lila didn't laugh or smile. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the door. As they continued on, the road seemed to conspire against them, the winds growing wilder, the rain lashing with renewed vigor. Ethan's focus remained on the path ahead, but he could sense the woman watching him, a silent, wet specter in the seat next to him. Suddenly, the car sputtered, the engine hiccuping before it roared back to life. Ethan's heart skipped a beat.
What the?
The woman placed a gentle hand on his arm.
It's all right. We're almost through the worst of it.
She said, her tone soothing, almost hypnotic. Ethan wanted to believe her, to trust in the serene certainty of her voice. Yet, as they rounded a sharp bend, the headlights illuminated a wall of fog, thick and impenetrable. Descending upon the road, he slowed the car to a crawl, peering into the whiteness that enveloped them, his senses heightened, searching for any sign of danger. The whispers returned, a chorus of sighs and murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. The woman's hand tightened on his arm, and when he looked at her, her eyes were wide, fixed on something beyond the windshield. There, in the middle of the road, stood a figure, shrouded in the mist. It was a man, or what Ethan assumed was once a man, dressed in tattered clothes that hung loosely from his frame. His face was obscured, but the aura of menace that surrounded him was unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The ghostly entity from the town's whispers. It was real. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at the car, and the whispers rose into a deafening roar. With a jolt of adrenaline, Ethan slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires spun on the wet pavement before gaining traction, propelling the car forward. The figure in the road grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it was consumed by the fog. The woman let out a long breath, her body sagging with relief.
Thank you,
she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan didn't respond, his mind racing with the implications of what they had just encountered. The storm began to wane, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. As they descended from the mountain, the first hints of dawn began to pierce the gloom, casting a pale light over the road that led them back to civilization.
You can drop me off at the gas station up ahead. I'll be fine from there.
Are you sure? I can drive you all the way to town.
No,
she said quickly.
the gas station is fine.
Ethan frowned but didn't argue. If that's what she wanted, he wouldn't push her. The rain continued to pound against the roof, and the wind howled through the trees, creating a symphony of sound that made the world feel small and isolated. As they neared the gas station, unease settled in. The lights were off, and the building looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and covered in graffiti. The pumps were rusted and cloaked in ivy, as if they hadn't been used in years.
Are you sure you want to get out here?
He asked, slowing the car to a stop. Lila nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt.
Yes. Thank you for the ride.
She opened the door and stepped out into the rain, her dress clinging to her legs. Ethan watched her for a moment, a strange sense of dread settling in his chest.
Wait,
He called out.
do you need a phone or anything? I can give you mine.
She shook her head.
I'll be fine. Thank you.
Before he could say anything else, she turned and walked toward the gas station, disappearing into the shadows. Ethan hesitated, fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Something about this didn't feel right. He reached for his phone, intending to call someone, anyone. But before he could dial, a loud thud startled him. He looked up just in time to see a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It was Lila.
What the?
Ethan muttered, heart racing. He quickly opened the door and stepped out into the rain, but when he looked back at the road, she was gone. Breath coming in short gasps, he spun around, searching for any sign of her. The rain made it nearly impossible to see, but there was no doubt in his mind that she had been there. Panic set in as he climbed back into the car and locked the doors. Hands trembling, he gripped the wheel, mind racing with possibilities. Was this some kind of prank? Had she tricked him? Or was it something else entirely? He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that the rain and darkness were playing tricks on him. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When he reached the town, he pulled into the parking lot of a small diner and sat there for a moment, trying to calm his nerves. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the neon sign above the diner flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow on the wet pavement. He needed to tell someone what had happened. He needed confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. Inside the diner, the warmth and smell of coffee offered relief from the cold night. He approached the counter, where a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes smiled at him.
Can I get you something, hun?
Just coffee.
He replied, his voice hoarse. She poured him a cup and slid it across the counter.
Rough night?
He nodded, taking a sip. The warmth spread through him, but it did little to ease the tension in his chest.
I picked up a hitchhiker on the mountain road.
He said, the words tumbling out.
She said her name was Lila. Do you know her?
The waitress's smile faded as she set the coffee pot down.
Lila? What did she look like?
Young, dark hair. She was wearing a white dress. She said her car broke down.
The waitress's face paled. She glanced at the cook in the kitchen who had stopped chopping vegetables and was now staring at them.
You need to leave, right now.
The waitress whispered. Ethan frowned.
What? Why?
Because Lila died. On that road. 5 years ago.
She said, voice shaking.
She was hit by a car while walking to the gas station. People see her all the time. They pick her up, just like you did. And then, she disappears.
Ethan's blood ran cold. He set the coffee cup down, hands trembling.
That's not possible. I saw her. I spoke to her.
The waitress nodded solemnly.
I believe you. But she's not real. Not anymore.
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as Ethan stumbled back to his car. The rain had stopped, but the night felt darker than ever. As he sat behind the wheel, he couldn't shake the image of Lila standing in the road. Her eyes filled with a sorrow he now recognized. He started the car and pulled onto the empty street, headlights cutting through the fog. In the rearview mirror, He thought he saw a figure sitting in the back seat, just for a moment. And then, it was gone.